There are moments in royal life that never make it into the official reports. Moments that happen behind closed doors, in hushed corridors, in the back rooms of airports where cameras don't reach and aides speak in careful whispers. Moments where the mask slips, not just for the royals themselves, but for the people sworn to protect them. People who have given their careers, their loyalty, and, in some cases, their entire sense of self to an institution that rarely says thank you out loud. This is one of those moments. It started, as so many royal controversies do, with something that looked perfectly ordinary on the surface. A scheduled flight. A young princess. A diary entry on a palace calendar that had been confirmed, rescheduled, confirmed again, and then, at the very last hour, quietly complicated by a set of decisions that seemed to come from somewhere above the logistics team, somewhere above the travel coordinators, somewhere that no one wanted to point a finger at directly. But someone did point a finger. And that someone wore a uniform. To understand what happened, you have to understand the world that Princess Charlotte moves through every single day. She is not simply a child who happens to have a famous family. She is the daughter of the Prince and Princess of Wales. She is fourth in line to the British throne. She is 11 years old, and she has already learned, in the way that royal children always learn, earlier than anyone should have to, that her life is not entirely her own. Her schedule, her movements, her appearances, and even her travel arrangements exist within a system that is bigger than any one person's preference or comfort. The people responsible for making that system work are not all famous. Most of them are invisible. Equerries, schedulers, advanced security teams, logistics coordinators, an entire army of professionals whose job is to make sure that when a member of the royal family moves from one place to another, everything goes smoothly. No delays. No confusion. No gaps in the security chain. And, at the very sharp end of that security chain, there are the royal protection officers. The men and women who stand close enough to touch. The ones who are there when the cameras turn off. The ones who know everything, see everything, and are required by their position to say almost nothing. One of those protection officers had been assigned to Princess Charlotte's travel detail for what was supposed to be a routine journey. The kind of thing that happens dozens of times a year, a flight from one royal residence to another, or perhaps to a private engagement, the exact nature of which was not publicly disclosed. What mattered, from a security standpoint, was that the arrangements had been locked in. The flight plan had been filed. The vehicles had been arranged. The timing had been set. And then, somewhere in the palace's upper structure, something changed. The word that filtered down to the security team was not dramatic. It never is, in these situations. It was simply a notification, polite, administrative, delivered in the language of institutional courtesy, that the flight arrangements for Princess Charlotte had been adjusted. The word adjusted was doing a great deal of heavy lifting. What it actually meant was that the original flight had been effectively cancelled. A different arrangement had been put in place. The princess would travel differently, at a different time, via a route that had not been vetted in advance by her primary protection detail. For most people reading that sentence, it might sound like a scheduling inconvenience. For a royal protection officer, it was something else entirely. Security for members of the royal family is not improvised. It is not flexible in the way that a meeting time is flexible. The routes are checked in advance. The variables are mapped. The risks are assessed before anyone sets foot in a vehicle or boards a plane. When arrangements change at the last minute, especially arrangements involving a child, the people responsible for that child's physical safety do not simply adapt and move on. They ask questions. They raise concerns. And, if those concerns are not addressed, they escalate. The officer in question escalated. What happened next is where the story becomes something more than a bureaucratic disagreement. Because the escalation did not go smoothly. The questions the officer raised were not answered with the transparency that security personnel require when a principal's travel plan has been altered without their input. Instead, the response that came back was, by multiple accounts, dismissive. The changes had been made. The decision had come from a level above the travel logistics team. The officer was expected to adapt to the new arrangements and proceed accordingly. This is where the furious outburst happened. The word furious is not an exaggeration. By the accounts that later circulated among palace staff, the kind of accounts that travel through the servant-side corridors of royal life with remarkable speed and equally remarkable detail, the officer's response to being told to simply accept the changes was not quiet. It was not professional in the way that palace corridors are supposed to be professional. It was, by the standards of an institution that runs almost entirely on suppressed emotion and controlled expression, a significant rupture. The officer did not threaten anyone. The anger was not directed at Princess Charlotte, or at the Wales family, or at the protection unit itself. It was directed squarely at the interference, at the fact that someone, somewhere, had reached into a confirmed security arrangement for a child and changed it, without consulting the people responsible for that child's safety, and was now apparently unwilling to explain why. That someone, according to the accounts that emerged in the weeks that followed, was connected to Queen Camilla's household. The relationship between Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen Camilla, consort to King Charles III, and the children of Prince William and Princess Catherine is a subject that has been handled with extraordinary delicacy in public discourse. The official line, repeated consistently across royal communications and friendly press profiles, is that Camilla has a warm and supportive relationship with her step-grandchildren. That she has made every effort not to intrude. That she respects the space between her role and theirs. The unofficial line, which circulates with equal consistency in less polished environments, is more complicated. Camilla came into the royal family through a door that was opened by one of the most painful and public marital breakdowns in modern history. The collapse of Charles and Diana's marriage, and the role that Camilla played in it, is not ancient history to the Wales children. It is their family history. It is the reason their grandmother, their real grandmother, Diana, is not alive to watch them grow up. It is the background context of every family gathering, every Christmas photograph, every state occasion at which they are all required to stand together and project unity for the cameras. The Wales children George, Charlotte, and Louis are too young to carry the full weight of that history themselves. But the people around them are not too young. And the loyalties within the palace's complex internal structure are not simple, and they are not always kind. When word began to spread that the disruption to Princess Charlotte's travel arrangements had originated, or been influenced, from within Camilla's sphere of palace operations, the reaction among the Wales household staff was not calm. There was a reason the protection officer had raised his voice. There was a reason the escalation had broken through the usual diplomatic surface of palace communication. Because this was not, in the perception of those closest to the Wales family, the first time something like this had happened. It was, however, the first time someone had been loud enough about it to make it difficult to ignore. Princess Charlotte, for her part, was not present when the argument happened. She did not witness the outburst. She did not know, in the way that an adult would know, exactly what the administrative storm around her travel arrangements meant or where it had come from. What she knew was that her plans had changed, that the adults around her were stressed in a way they were working hard to hide, and that she would not be traveling when and how she had expected to. Children in royal families learn very early to read the emotional temperature of a room without being told what the thermometer says. Charlotte is, by all accounts, an unusually perceptive child. She notices things. She remembers things. She asks, in the direct and slightly disconcerting way that children sometimes do, the questions that adults are hoping she won't ask. She asked where she was going instead. She was told, in the gentle and slightly evasive language that palace staff use with royal children, that there had been a small change in the arrangements and that everything was being sorted out. She reportedly nodded, looked at the aide who had delivered this information for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then went back to what she had been doing. The adults in the room exchanged a look. The security officer who had raised his voice was, in the immediate aftermath of the incident, placed in the awkward position that institutions always create for people who break the rules of emotional containment. He had done something correct, he had flagged a genuine security concern about a legitimate risk to a protected principal. But he had done it loudly, and, in doing it loudly, he had created a different kind of problem. The kind of problem that palace environments are not designed to resolve through direct confrontation. He was not disciplined. At least not formally, and not immediately. But he was made aware, through the careful language of institutional feedback, that his approach had been noted, that his concerns had been received, and that in future, the appropriate channels should be used. He had used the appropriate channels. They hadn't worked. So he had used a louder channel. He was not, by any stretch of available reporting, apologetic about this. What emerged from conversations between palace insiders in the days that followed was a picture of something that had been building for a while. Not just around this specific travel incident, but around a broader pattern of friction, small decisions, quiet redirections, minor interferences that individually might mean nothing but, together were beginning to form a shape that people inside the palace were starting to recognize. The Wales household and the king's household are not the same thing. They operate from different residences, with different staff, different priorities, and, increasingly different public identities. The king and queen are the reigning monarchs. William and Catherine are the heirs, the future, the people the public has largely chosen as the next chapter of the institution. These two gravitational fields are not always perfectly aligned. And, when they pull in different directions, the people caught between them, the staff, the security teams, the aides and administrators who serve both sides of the family without technically belonging to either, feel the strain. The protection officer had felt the strain. And he had, for one significant moment in a palace corridor, refused to absorb it silently. That refusal would set off a chain of conversations, investigations, and quiet reckonings that were only just beginning. The travel arrangements for Princess Charlotte were eventually resolved. She reached her destination. She was safe, and she arrived without public incident, and the official record of that day contains no mention of anything unusual having occurred. But, inside the palace, among the people who had heard the raised voice and understood what it meant, the day was already being filed under a category that palace staff know well and palace communications teams dread. The category of things that happened, that mattered, and that everyone agreed, for now, to pretend had not. Palaces are not quiet places, despite everything they do to appear that way. From the outside, the British royal family presents one of the most carefully managed images in the world. Every photograph is considered. Every public statement is weighed. Every family gathering, every walkabout, every waved hand from a car window is part of a vast, slow-moving production designed to project stability, continuity, and the impression that everything always is under control. Inside, it is something else. Inside, there are rivalries that go back decades. There are staff who have served through multiple monarchs and carry loyalty structures that do not fit neatly on any organizational chart. There are people who love the institution deeply and fight for their corner of it with everything they have. And there are, occasionally, moments when two corners of that institution push against each other hard enough that something gives. In the weeks following the incident with Princess Charlotte's travel arrangements, the palace did what it always does with uncomfortable internal events. It managed them. Carefully, quietly, and with the particular institutional skill of making a problem smaller without actually solving it. The security officer who had raised his voice was not removed from his post. He was not publicly reprimanded. He was, in the language of palace management, handled, which is to say that the right conversations were had with the right people, his concerns were documented in the appropriate formats, and the message was delivered, gently but unmistakably, that his passion for his principal's safety was valued, and that the specific way he had expressed it on that particular day was not something that should be repeated. He accepted this. He was a professional. He had been a professional for many years. He understood that accepting the message was part of the job. What he did not accept, privately, was that the underlying problem had been addressed. Because it hadn't. It had been smoothed over. There is a difference, and people who work close to the ground in institutions like the royal family know the difference better than almost anyone. The underlying problem was this: Princess Charlotte's travel arrangements had been disrupted by an intervention that originated from, or was connected to, the household of Queen Camilla. That intervention had been made without consultation with the Wales family's security team. It had been implemented in a way that overrode a confirmed arrangement. And, when questions had been raised about why, the answers provided had been administrative, procedural justifications that technically explained the mechanism of the change without addressing its origin or its purpose. To the people who managed security for the Wales family, this was not a satisfying answer. And, as the days passed, and as the details of the incident were discussed in the quiet conversations that palace staff have in canteens and corridors and car parks, a question began to take shape that no one was comfortable asking out loud but that everyone was thinking. Why would anyone connected to Queen Camilla's household have reason to interfere with arrangements made for Princess Charlotte? The easy answer, the one that palace communications would prefer, is that there is no good reason, that the interference was an administrative error, that lines of communication crossed in an unfortunate way, and that lessons have been learned. This is the answer that gets written into the internal review notes and filed away. The harder answer, the one that doesn't go away just because it's inconvenient, involves looking at the architecture of royal family dynamics more honestly. Queen Camilla's position within the royal family is one of the most carefully negotiated in modern royal history. She came in as the woman who had, in the public's perception, contributed to the destruction of one of the most beloved royal marriages of the 20th century. She has spent more than 2 decades working to transform that perception, with considerable success, by most measures. She is now queen. She is respected by many. She has cultivated a public image of warmth, humor, and a sensible kind of pragmatism that plays well against the more formal aspects of royal protocol. But the private dynamics, the ones that operate between households, between staff, between the different power centers of a family that is also an institution, are not the same as the public image. Princess Catherine and Queen Camilla have always existed in a relationship that requires careful management. Catherine is the Princess of Wales. She carries the title that Diana held. She is William's wife, the mother of the future king, and the person around whom the next chapter of the royal family is being built. The public adoration directed at Catherine, the comparisons to Diana, the emotional investment that people feel in her and her children represents a kind of soft power that sits in an interesting relationship with Camilla's harder, more established institutional authority as queen consort. These are not women who are at war. That framing is too dramatic and too simple. But they are women who operate in overlapping spaces within the same institution, with staff who serve both of them, with priorities that do not always align, and with a family history that contains more fault lines than any press release will ever acknowledge. When something connected to Camilla's household reaches into an arrangement made for Charlotte, a child who was also, specifically, Diana's granddaughter, the symbolism inside the palace is not lost on anyone who works there. The Wales children occupy a unique position in the public imagination. George, Charlotte, and Louis are not simply royal children. They are, in a very real sense, the continuation of something that millions of people grieved when Diana died. The public emotional investment in these 3 children is partly about them as individuals, partly about their parents, and partly about a feeling of continuation, the idea that something of Diana lives on in them, and should be protected. The palace knows this. The Wales household knows this. And the people who manage security for those children carry it with them in everything they do. When the protection officer raised his voice in that corridor, he was not simply angry about a scheduling conflict. He was angry because, from where he stood, a child under his protection had been placed in a position of avoidable uncertainty by a decision made outside his chain of command, and the people responsible for that decision were not providing adequate transparency about why it had been made. In security terms, unexplained changes to confirmed travel arrangements are exactly the kind of thing that protocols exist to prevent. Not because every unexplained change conceals a threat, most of them don't, but because the discipline of maintaining the protocol is what makes the protocol worth having. The moment you start accepting last-minute overrides without proper explanation, you have created a vulnerability. And the people who understand security at this level do not accept vulnerabilities quietly. The raised voice was, in this reading, not an emotional failure. It was a professional statement, delivered at an inappropriate volume, about an inappropriate situation. The fact that it was dismissed, managed rather than resolved, did not make the situation less inappropriate. It just made it quieter. The details that circulated among palace staff in the aftermath of the incident painted a picture that was, in its specific texture, more nuanced than either the protective officer loses temper narrative or the palace smooths things over narrative. Several members of staff who had knowledge of the events described a pattern that went beyond the single flight incident. There had been other moments, smaller, easier to dismiss individually, in which the administrative boundary between the king's household and the Wales household had been crossed in ways that felt, to those working closely with William and Catherine, like more than simple miscommunication. Calendar conflicts. Event scheduling that seemed to inadvertently disadvantage the Wales family's public engagements. Resource allocations, cars, staff, venue access that occasionally landed in ways that benefited one side of the family at a cost to the other. None of these individually amounted to a scandal. None of them, taken alone, would be worth writing a story about. Together, they were worth noticing. The word that came up repeatedly in accounts from palace insiders was competition. Not open competition, not anything that could be pointed to in a single document or a single decision. But the quiet, structural kind of competition that develops naturally when two powerful households operate in the same institutional space, with overlapping resources, and with very different ideas about what the future of the monarchy should look like. King Charles and Queen Camilla represent one vision of that future. Prince William and Princess Catherine represent another. These visions are not incompatible, and, in public, they are presented as entirely aligned. But visions that involve power, legacy, and the direction of one of the world's most watched institutions rarely stay perfectly aligned under the surface, regardless of what the photographs suggest. The specific question of what happened with Princess Charlotte's flight was not, in the end, answered with full transparency by anyone in an official capacity. The palace did not issue a statement. The Wales household did not comment. The protection officer remained in his post and declined to speak publicly about the matter. What filled that silence was the thing that always fills silence around the royal family: interpretation. Some of the interpretation was careful and fair. Perhaps Camilla's household had made an administrative error. Perhaps the travel coordination across two households had simply failed in the routine way that complex scheduling sometimes fails, and the security officer had caught the failure at the worst possible moment in the worst possible mood, and his reaction had been shaped more by accumulated stress than by the specific incident. This is possible. It is, in fact, a reasonable explanation. But it is not the only reasonable explanation. And the people who work inside the palace, who have watched the relationship between the two royal households evolve over years, who know where the fault lines run and what the fault lines are made of, were not, by all accounts, satisfied with administrative error as a complete picture. What they were watching, in the weeks following the outburst, was whether the pattern continued. Whether the frictions that had been building would be addressed, genuinely resolved, in a way that reflected an acknowledgement that something real had gone wrong. Or whether they would be managed in the way that institutional problems usually get managed: papered over, quietly filed, and allowed to wait. Princess Charlotte was photographed at a public engagement approximately 2 weeks after the incident. She was with her parents and her brothers. She looked entirely like herself, composed, curious, slightly apart from her siblings in the way that middle children sometimes are, watching the crowd with the particular alertness of a child who has learned to read rooms. She was wearing a pale blue coat. She had a small handbag. She waved when the crowd waved at her. She smiled at something George said, the kind of genuine, slightly reluctant smile of a younger sister who was not going to let her older brother know she found it funny. None of this had anything to do with disrupted travel arrangements or raised voices in palace corridors. And yet the people who had been watching the internal situation, who had heard about the outburst, who had connected the dots between the intervention and its origin, who had watched the institutional management of the aftermath, saw in that photograph something that ordinary observers probably did not. They saw a child who moved through a world that was always more complicated than it looked. And they saw the people around her: guards, aides, protection officers, doing the work that keeps that complexity invisible. The protection officer who had raised his voice was among the people standing at the edge of that event. Not in the frame. Not in any photograph that would ever be published. But close enough to do his job, in the quiet, invisible way that his job required, on all the days that were not the day he had been loud. He did not look like someone who had made a mistake. He looked like someone who was watching. The British royal family has survived things that would have destroyed any ordinary institution. It has survived public rejection, constitutional crisis, media warfare, grief played out in front of a global audience, and the slow, grinding erosion of deference that defined the 20th century's relationship with inherited power. It has survived because it adapts, not quickly, and not always gracefully, but consistently enough that it is still standing when the crisis has passed. What it is less good at surviving, in the long run, is the internal kind of damage. The kind that doesn't come from the outside. The kind that grows in the spaces between households, between loyalties, between the official version of events and the one that everyone inside the building already knows. In the months following the incident that had sent a royal protection officer's voice echoing through a palace corridor, the question of what it meant not just operationally, but institutionally was one that a number of people were quietly considering. They were not people who would ever discuss it on the record. They were not people who would write op-eds or give anonymous quotes to newspapers or appear on the kind of royal commentary programs that fill cable television schedules with speculation and retired press secretaries. They were simply people who had worked close to power long enough to recognize when something was shifting. And something was shifting. The relationship between Prince William and King Charles has always been one of the more closely watched dynamics in the modern monarchy. Father and son. Current king and future king. Two men who love each other and have grieved together and who also, by the nature of the institution they both serve, exist in a structural tension that cannot be dissolved simply by goodwill. William watched his mother die, in part, as a consequence of what happened inside his family. He watched a marriage collapse under the weight of infidelity and incompatibility and the suffocating pressure of royal life. He watched his father choose Camilla, and he watched the public slowly come to accept that choice, and he arrived at his own form of acceptance because he is a man who understands that life is complicated and that his father is a human being, not just a king. But understanding something intellectually is not the same as finding it emotionally simple. The presence of Queen Camilla in the royal family's inner circle is not something that William navigates on autopilot. It is something he navigates with deliberate care. And, when events occur that suggest the boundary between the two households is not being respected, when something connected to Camilla's sphere of influence reaches into an arrangement made for his daughter, that care becomes something harder. It becomes vigilance. The protection officer's outburst was, in this broader reading, not just a security professional losing his temper over a scheduling override. It was a symptom of something that the Wales household had been carrying quietly for a while. A sense that the space they had carved out for themselves, for their children, for the particular version of royal life they were trying to build, was not quite as protected as it needed to be. William did not raise his voice. That is not how he operates, and that is not how he has been trained to operate, and the number of times in his adult life that he has allowed his private feelings to become publicly visible can be counted on one hand. But the people around him, the people who know how to read the particular temperature of his silences, knew that the incident had registered. That it had been noted. That it had added to a running tally that was being kept, quietly, by a man who does not forget things easily. Princess Catherine's response to the events was, if anything, even less visible than her husband's. Catherine has cultivated, over more than a decade of royal life, a capacity for composure that is genuinely remarkable. She does not give things away. She does not signal distress through body language in ways that cameras can catch. She is, in the estimation of people who have watched her work for years, one of the most emotionally disciplined public figures in the world. What she said privately, in the conversations that happen between a wife and husband at the end of days that have been hard in ways that cannot be discussed at the dinner table, is not known. It will not be known. That is one of the few genuine privacies that the Wales family has managed to maintain. What is known, from the accounts of people who worked closely with the household in this period, is that the travel incident involving Charlotte had not passed without consequence in terms of how the Wales household approached its internal security protocols. There were meetings. There were reviews. There were conversations about how confirmed arrangements should be communicated across palace departments in ways that made unauthorized interference more difficult. These changes were framed, in the language of institutional process, as routine security reviews. Which they were, technically. And they were also, to anyone paying attention, a direct response to what had happened. A tightening of the perimeter, in the formal vocabulary of a household that had decided it needed to protect itself a little more carefully than it had been doing. Queen Camilla, in the public record of this period, was present at several engagements alongside King Charles. She was photographed. She shook hands. She delivered the particular brand of warm, slightly self-deprecating charm that has become her public signature. She attended events with members of the Wales family and was photographed alongside them in the way that family photographs require, assembled, smiling, presenting the unified face of the institution to the world. Whether she was aware of the specific details of the protection officer's outburst is a question that has no publicly available answer. Whether she knew that the decision connected to her household had created a security-level dispute is similarly unverifiable from the outside. What is verifiable is that the palace manages information internally with considerable care. The people at the top of these household structures know, in general terms, what is happening in their environment. They may not know every detail, but they know the emotional weather. They know when something has happened that has changed the atmosphere between two parts of the family. Camilla has been navigating that atmospheric complexity for her entire time within the royal family. She is not a person who stumbles into these situations without awareness of their texture. Whether she chose to acknowledge this particular moment, or to allow it to be managed by the institutional machinery that surrounds all of them, is something that only she knows. The protection officer at the center of the incident continued his work. He was not celebrated for his outburst. That is not how these situations resolve. He was not punished for it in any formal or permanent way. He occupied the strange middle space that institutions create for people who are right about something and wrong about how they expressed it, a space where the rightness and the wrongness cancel each other out in institutional terms, leaving the person simply there, doing their job, carrying knowledge that the official record does not contain. He was seen, in the weeks after the incident, at several Wales household engagements. He was doing what protection officers do, standing at the edge of things, watching, assessing, present without being visible. His expression in the photographs where he appears, incidentally, at the margins of royal events, is the expression of a man doing his job. Several people who knew him described, in the careful language of professional loyalty, a man who had not changed his fundamental view of what had happened or why it had mattered. He had raised a concern. The concern had been valid. The fact that the way he raised it had briefly disrupted the polished surface of palace life was, from his perspective, a secondary consideration to the fact that the concern was valid. He was not, apparently, interested in the palace's preference for smoothness over accuracy. This is, in its way, a very British kind of stubbornness. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that simply continues to be itself regardless of institutional pressure. In the broader context of the monarchy's current moment, the incident exists as one data point among many. The British royal family is in a period of significant transition. King Charles is navigating the first years of a reign that began later than anyone had anticipated and carries with it all the complexity of following a monarch who reigned for 70 years. William and Catherine are building toward a future that is increasingly in focus, a future in which they will be, eventually, the center of the institution. The dynamics between these two phases of the monarchy's story are not always frictionless. They are, sometimes, competitive in the quiet structural way that families and institutions are competitive when they share space and resources and are trying to tell slightly different stories about who they are. The story that the Wales family tells about itself, the one about service and modernity and a different kind of royal life, built around their children and their values and a deliberate rejection of some of the dynamics that had made earlier generations of royals so publicly unhappy, requires a certain kind of protection. Not just physical protection, the kind that the officers in dark suits provide, but institutional protection. The protection of a boundary that says, this household is its own thing. These children are growing up in a particular way. The decisions about their lives belong to their parents. When that boundary is crossed even once, even in ways that can be explained as administrative error, the people responsible for maintaining it notice. And, some of them, it turns out, are willing to say so out loud. Princess Charlotte turned a year older not long after these events. She celebrated with her family, in the private way that the Wales children's celebrations have generally been kept away from cameras, away from the formal machinery of royal event management, as close to ordinary as the family of the Prince of Wales can get. A small set of photographs was released, as it always is. Charlotte in a garden. Charlotte smiling at the camera with the particular confidence of a child who has learned to meet the lens without flinching. Charlotte looking, in the way she often looks in official photographs, like someone who is already thinking about something you can't quite see. There was nothing in the photographs that referenced disrupted flights or raised voices or the quiet diplomatic aftermath of an institutional friction. There was a child having a birthday. There were flowers. There was a cake. The protection officer who had, months earlier, made himself briefly and pointedly audible in a palace corridor was not in the photographs. He was never in the photographs. That is the nature of his work. But, somewhere at the edge of whatever private celebration took place, in the careful perimeter that exists around royal children at all times, he or someone very like him was present. Watching. Assessing. Doing the invisible work that ensures that the visible moments, the photographs, the smiles, the flowers and the cake can happen at all. This is the part of royal life that press releases don't cover and commentary shows don't analyze. The part where ordinary people, in extraordinary proximity to power, make decisions every day about how much of what they know to carry quietly and how much of it to put down in the corridor and let echo. Most of them carry it. Almost all of them, almost all of the time, absorb the weight without making a sound. One officer, on one specific day, made a different choice. He was not wrong about the reason. And the institution he serves has not, by any available evidence, become more willing to acknowledge why the reason mattered. But, somewhere in a file that will not be publicly released, in the administrative record of a palace that is very good at creating administrative records, the moment exists. It happened. A man raised his voice for a child who did not know he had done it. For a child who was safe, who arrived, who smiled for a photograph 2 weeks later as if none of it had occurred. She probably didn't know. She was the point of the whole thing. And that, in the end, is the only version of this story that actually matters.